Thanks, everybody. I'm Tanner Johnson. I'm the VP of Global Finance Operations at Nike. I'm super excited to be here. I've been part of the AICPA for over 20 years, and so to be part of this group and help shape the future is super inspiring to me. So without further ado, I'll do the official introduction of Pascal Finette. And I was given the short version, which is still super impressive. So Pascal's the co-founder of B Radical. He's Ernst & Young's Wavespace Advisory Board Chair. If you haven't done an EY Wavespace, I highly recommend it. It was a huge unlock for my team in my last role. And Pascal is also a member of Pearson's Digital Advisory Board. Previously, he held leadership positions at Google.org, Mozilla, and eBay. He's built technology startups and has launched a venture capital firm. He is the posse leader of the Heretic.org and a general startup when it comes to creating meaningful change. And a fun fact that he shared with me before I came up is he was also the Pilates instructor to 2 Olympic marathon runners. And Pascal, I'm just trying to get a 5K done. So maybe at the break you could teach me some core moves and some other ones here as well. So without further ado, let's welcome Pascal.
All right, so I hope you all brought comfortable shoes. Pilates? All right. Let me see. Clicker. There we go. Well, good morning. It's an absolute honor, pleasure to be here with you. I'm about 14 feet tall, so I think I'm good standing here. You can see me in the back, right? Like, I don't need to stand behind the podium. Like, perfect. Awesome. All right, so what we're going to do is, for the next 45 minutes, I want to take you a little bit on a trip into the whole world of disruption. And I'll tell you a little bit more where that came from and why we're so passionate about it. And I hope I bring some probably rather interesting and new perspectives to the topic, which has been around for a little while. And then we'll bring back Tanner, because Tanner kindly volunteered to talk a little bit about how the things we have found resonate at Nike, and then we'll have you actually work through this stuff. So this is the part where you lean in a little bit and be active, and we keep this super interactive. But I will want to walk you through a little bit of our findings first. Now, I want to start us off with a quote, because I think that quote summarizes so beautifully where we are in the world today. This is Jorge Paulo Lemann. He is essentially the Ray Dalio of Brazil. So he runs a very large hedge fund over there. He was on in an interview with either Fortune or Forbes. I need to double check that quote. But I give him a lot of credit, because he said this on stage in front of a running camera. And I think as a leader, that's a pretty bold statement. He said, "I'm a terrified dinosaur." And essentially said, like you could do things the old way, and you really focus on efficiency and you'd be okay, and now we're getting disrupted in all different ways. And I think that's exactly what happens in the world. And I'm pretty sure you and your teams and your colleagues, your C-suite colleagues actually all feel this. And by the way, you will get all the slides, so if you want to reference the slides later, we'll make sure that you have them. So starting there, I want to talk a little bit about disruption. So 2 things we're going to do today. I'm going to talk about disruption. I want to give you a different perspective on disruption, because I think there's a massive mistake we're making when we talk about this topic. And then we'll talk about how do you actually successfully navigate disruption. And along the way, I will tell you a whole bunch of stories about the clients we work with and the insights we gained. But let's talk about disruption. Now, when you look at disruption, the data around disruption is pretty dire, and we know this for a long time. Like Clayton Christensen in one of his earlier works showed you, and if you're in the consumer goods industry, you know this better than I do, 95% of product innovations fail. In the startup world, Startup Genome Report reports 92% of startups fail. I think that's actually underreported. I think, being a startup guy, I can tell you that the death rate of the carnage rate in Silicon Valley is significantly higher than 92%. It also is, what I found fascinating is when you start digging into the literature and you look at why does this actually happen, particularly in incumbent, in established organizations, you realize there's a study which was done by a subdivision of Deloitte, which found that 82% of companies tackle an innovation project with the same rigor and the same methodologies as they would do for their normal work. I mean, that's staggering. That just makes no sense whatsoever, because clearly innovation is a different beast. And then InnoSight publishes for years now, and I'm pretty sure you heard that number, the 2021 report just came out, and they basically said that they expect that about 50% of Fortune 500s will drop out of the Fortune 500, will be replaced in the next 10 years. So there's a lot of stuff happening in the world. I actually think it's pretty exciting because it gives opportunity, right? So it's not a dire picture. It's a dire picture if you're not acting on it. So we got pretty interested in this. And about 4-ish years ago, I was at Singularity University. I was a founding member of Singularity University, which is this weird think tank in Silicon Valley. I got super obsessed with this word disruption, because everybody likes to throw it around. I heard a lot of my colleagues like basically walking around, it's like, you get disrupted, you get disrupted. It's a bit like, Oprah, like, and you get a car, and you get disrupted. And quite frankly, I think the word is meaningless. If I'm a vegetarian, if you've ever eaten vegetarian food, you know tofu. Tofu tastes like absolutely nothing. And then you put sauce on it, it tastes like the sauce. And disruption is the same thing. It just means nothing. And the only person in the world who likes the word disruption is a consultant, because if you're a consultant, you love going to your clients and you're like, you get disrupted. And then your client is like, oh my God, take my money. Right? So it works, right? So we went back to what is the earliest definition we could find for the word disruption, just as a starting point. And this is from 1500. This is 500 years ago. This is literally the first definition we could find. Disruption being a rending asunder, bursting apart, a forcible separation into parts. And I think that's a good starting point. Now, with that being said, if anyone ever tells you a story about disruption, they always tell you a story. You're nodding. You're like, yeah, of course I heard the story of Kodak and Blockbuster and Nokia. And if you're anything like me, you just want to vomit. Right? Because like, you heard that story so many times. It's always the same story, always the same way we tell the story. It's always, oh, Kodak, the inventor of the digital camera, got disrupted by Instagram. Blockbuster got disrupted by Netflix. Nokia gets disrupted by the iPhone and Android. And I think that's fine. I think there's an interesting obsession we have looking at the disruptors. And there's lots we can learn, and make no mistake. Like, there's a ton we can learn from the Netflixes of this world. But I do think we're missing a much more important point. And that is the point where our theory of disruption comes from. Because here's the thing. The underlying job to be done, this is the late work of Clayton Christensen, and if you're not familiar with it, it's a must read. The underlying job to be done has never changed. In pretty much any disruption you can think about, the underlying consumer need, the actual need, never changes. You're still taking pictures. Arguably, you take way more pictures than you ever done before. They just don't happen to be on film. You're still watching a movie. You still get entertained. It's just not on VHS videotape. You're still communicating. It just looks differently. And that's the reason why we like to think about disruption, and that this is important. I think it's important to understand as a state change. And state change is this idea, it comes out of the physics, of the world of physics and chemistry. If you take water, water is frozen. When it's frozen, it's ice, it's solid. You warm it, it becomes water. You warm it further, it becomes liquid, it becomes gas. The in-between is what is called a state change. And the reason why I think this analog works so well is because the underlying molecule, water, H2O, has never changed. The underlying consumer need doesn't change. What changes is the way we deliver that need. And this is a state change. The other thing about state changes is they don't happen in a nice linear progression. They happen in these like slightly exponential curves. A good example is if you've ever boiled water for spaghetti, happens to me all the time when I cook spaghetti. You know what I mean? It's like you look at the spaghetti, you're waiting for the water to boil because you want to, like, it needs to boil properly to put spaghetti in. The moment you turn around, it boils over, always. Now, the way we like to think about this is this. You're currently in a particular state, in a particular way you deliver your product or your service to your customer. And there's always, in each state, is a phase of stability. This is fantastic for the incumbent, because this is where you build the moat around your organization. This is where you're untouchable. If you're not making big mistakes, you're making all the money, you have got great profit margins, et cetera, et cetera. If you're a startup, you never ever want to attack an incumbent in this state, because it's virtually impossible. But then you see the gradual changes happening. This is where, in the futurist community, we talk about the weak signals, where you see the early indicators of change emerging. You see a new way of fulfilling a customer need emerging, and then eventually they become from gradual to sudden, and then they start flipping, and we see the weak signals turning into strong signals, and the world changes. And this has interesting implications. Let me give you an example. Let's talk about Blockbuster. And the reason why I like to talk Blockbuster is not because I like bashing Blockbuster, but rather because everybody knows the story. Blockbuster State, the thing they delivered their product or service to their customer was, of course, VHS video cassettes. Now, the interesting thing about Blockbuster is, Blockbuster by no means was an entertainment company. Blockbuster is a real estate company. Blockbuster had some 9,000 stores at the very end of their empire. They knew better than anyone else where to place a store, how to merchandise a store, how to run that store. That's a very healthy skill if you're in a world where you have to go to the store, you have to bring your cassette, pick up a video cassette, etc. Arguably, many other companies which are like this. McDonald's famously is a real estate company. Starbucks arguably is not a coffee company, it's a real estate company. Now here's a fascinating thing. The state changed. We went from VHS video cassettes to DVDs. And what happens when you look at a DVD is, of course, you realize, man, a DVD is flat. It's thin, I can put it into an envelope, I can actually ship it to you. So I can actually deliver you the service. The same thing, you're still watching the same movie, just happens to be in a slightly different state. But I can give you the movie in a different state. And this is where it gets really interesting, and this is where I find, my company, we work predominantly with large corporations around the world. This is where it's really hard for large corporations to act. Because here's the thing. Once you move from one state to the next, your existing skills and processes become irrelevant. You now need to know how to run a mail order operation, not how to run a store. Like your skill, all the real estate skill you have in your company becomes overnight essentially worthless. But now you need to have a very different skill, which is how do you actually run a mail order operation? Where do you put your distribution center? How do you negotiate with UPS or USPS or wherever it is? How do you run this most efficiently? Your existing skills and processes become irrelevant, and that's really, really hard to overcome. We'll see this later in terms of how do we actually manage this. And then, of course, the state changed once again. The state changed from DVDs to streaming, and again, your existing skills and processes become irrelevant because you don't need to run a mail order operation anymore. It makes no difference whatsoever. Now you need to know how to run a server farm and how to write software and negotiate with Hollywood so you get streaming rights, et cetera, et cetera. And the sole reason why Netflix could do this, and we know this, of course, is because Reed Hastings knew when they founded Netflix that the DVD is just an in-between state. They knew from the get-go that streaming is the thing they actually want to do. But they couldn't because the state wasn't matured enough. So think about your industry, and I would argue state changes not just happen in the core of your product, they happen also in the way you do marketing, in the way you do fulfillment, in the way you do, any part of your business is constantly going through state changes. And the state changes, and this is the important thing for us, the state changes happen faster. We always had state changes. Like the classic example is always this horses and buggies got disrupted by the car, the old story, right? And it took 50 years. That's true. But the horses and buggies, if you think about the underlying consumer need, that consumer need to this day hasn't changed. You want to get from A to B in the least amount of time, cheapest, most convenient. It was horses and buggies, the car comes along, now it's a car, and then eventually becomes, self-driving, flying, robo-taxis. The changes are happening faster and faster. And my invitation for you, and this is what we're going to focus on for the rest of this, is kind of get rid of this word of disruption, because disruption, again, is I think it's a misnomer. What we really need to think about is transformation. Because most of the time, I have a really hard time, I thought really hard about where do I actually see disruptions which are truly new consumer needs. It's not happening all that often. It happens, make no mistake, but it doesn't happen all that often. So it's really more about transformation. And ultimately, as an organization, I would invite you to think about sustainable relevance. How do you actually keep relevant in the consumer need you're fulfilling at the moment? So with that being said, so this is 4 years ago. So we started doing this. We started developing this model. We brought it to our clients. It's helpful for them, I can tell you. It's a helpful mental model to think about. And then we got really interested in disruption because, again, for me, it's tofu, and we wanted to disrupt it because I thought, why not? And we started talking to people. And this is where the second part, the main part of what I want to show you and share with you now comes from. we started talking to people, and in the end, we ended up talking to more than, by now, 200, it's ongoing research. We talked to 250 innovation practitioners. And these are people who are anything from people from Google X, so the crazy innovation lab over at Google, to the head of moonshots for Telefonica Alpha, so on the tech side, but also people like Gisbert Rühl, the CEO of Klöckner, largest steel company in Europe, which today, after a 7-year-long transformation, makes 50% of their revenue digital. It's a steel company, right? So really fascinating. So we talked to all kinds of people. And at the very beginning of our journey, I interviewed this gentleman here. This is Andy Billings. Andy has become a dear friend of ours. He's the head of creative profitability at Electronic Arts, the game maker. And what's interesting about Electronic Arts is the company is, 40 plus years old now, has stayed relevant in an industry which is changing so dramatically every couple of years. If you're in games, you went from console to PCs to social gaming, and the company stayed relevant. And I asked Andy, I was like, Andy, explain to me, how did you stay relevant? How did you do this? And he gave me a whole bunch of pointers, but then he ended our interview with a really interesting comment. And that stoked us to essentially embark on this research journey. And I want to share this with you. He said to me this.
I think what's maybe overrated is it really possible to be planful, thoughtful, effective, well-organized, and linear in managing disruptive change? I think when you talk to people on the front line, they go, it doesn't look like what it's described as in the books.
And I think that's exactly right, because I've read all the books, and I'm like, talk to the practitioners, and I'm like, you know what, like and you know this, like the moment you get into the trenches, like the reality looks different. So we ended up speaking to the practitioners. We said, like, you know what, if you can't find it in the books, let's talk to the practitioners. And then, of course, as you can imagine, once you start talking to practitioners, you talk to, in our case, 200 plus people, you get this interesting, mesmerizing collection of anecdotes and stories. And then it looks, my office for a while looked like I was one of these like conspiracy theorists, like where you have like the whole wall full of stuff with like little pins and like, but you see patterns emerge, of course. And we found 5 keys, and I want to present them to you. And the summarization, I know it's early in the morning, it's like, no daylight in this room, so if you're nodding off later, it's totally fine. I hope to keep you entertained though. But if you want to have the mental shortcut, it's really this. It's not complicated. None of the stuff I'm going to tell you will be like, oh my God, Pascal, I've never thought about this. Like, absolutely not. Everything I'm going to tell you is common sense. But common sense doesn't mean it's common practice. Because it's really not complicated, it's really just hard. And so with that being said, let me share 5 keys. The 5 keys we found, again, the most successful, innovative, disruptive companies which have stayed relevant for a long period of time, so not just like the one-hit wonders, have all in common. And some of them I will go through a little quicker. Some of them I think are much more relevant to this particular audience, so we'll spend a little bit more time on them. First one, and interestingly, by the way, when Tom and I sat down and we talked about this, a lot of the research Tom has done, and you might be aware of, like fits beautifully into what we've seen. So there's clear overlap here. So for honest, first one, everyone told us, like, it's all about the process. You need to have the right process. And when they say process, they mean, of course, agility, like an agile process. And here's a fascinating thing if you think about agility. Because to this day, I hear people who are like talking about agile as this like incredibly like weird thing from the future. We've been doing design thinking since the 90s. And even more so, we've been doing all of this stuff for years, for decades. Even if you take the last kind of like hooray of this, if you take the Lean Startup book by Eric Ries, which, reasonably famous, like that came out 10 years ago. So the important thing when you think about like process is we actually know how to do this. There's no question. It's not some like crazy science which has been discovered at a university and like we need to translate academia into real world. No, we've been doing this. Now, the interesting thing is though, this is the State of Agile report, which is an industry report. When you look at where do we actually use agile methodologies, it's pretty dire. Software development, clearly, absolutely. And this is, technologies like Scrum and so on, if you've heard this. But in other places, like finance, for example, it's 10%. I mean, it's just like devastating. Like there's a huge opportunity for us to become more agile. And when I talk about agility, I think the important thing about agile to understand is I'm not talking about a very specific process. I'm not saying, oh, you all need to be like Scrum Masters or something. What I'm talking about is why do you actually engage in agile and what does it matter? So first of all, this is same report, so this is the State of Agile report. This is the reported benefits of companies which have adopted an agile process across the organization. And I think if you look at what do I actually desire for my organization, you see this is like exactly what you desire, right? Like things like manage changing priorities, getting better visibility, increasing productivity, have better time to market, have better alignment across my teams. All of these are the benefits you get when you adopt an agile mindset and ultimately an agile process. And the simple thing you need to know about agility is essentially agility means you acknowledge the complexity of your inability to understand where the future will go. And thus you get into much quicker cycles. That's all agile is. There's a beautiful quote from Mark Zuckerberg. So Facebook used to have an internal employee manual, which they call the little red book. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about Facebook, but different story. In this book, he has got a really beautiful quote. He said, I know where we need to be in 30 years. And I know what we are going to do in the next 3 to 6 months. Everything in between, we have no idea. And I think that's pretty accurate. If you think about the world we're living in today and the way technology evolves, etc., I think you need to have a clear picture, a North Star, and you need to do planning, no question about it. But really acknowledging the fact that you don't know what happens in 3 years. Amazon, probably the most agile company of any, I guess, in terms of at least large companies. This is Jeff Bezos. He once said that doing things at high speed is the best defense against the future, and I think that's exactly right. Now, the question we like to ask, and you will see me, I have these like provocations for you, and you can take them later, we can have conversation around them, but the question I like to ask my clients is, when we do these sessions, and I just present them the framework, is like sit down with them and say, like, how agile are you really? And we go through, their individual processes, the parts of the organization, and say, where do you actually have opportunity for you to become more agile? So this is number one, process. Second one, we'll not spend too much time on this. I think it's more relevant for people who are at the front lines of making product and services, etc. But the best companies start from a deep understanding, a first principles level understanding of their consumer needs. And that sounds obvious, but it isn't. So first principles thinking, of course, goes back to Aristotle. 2,500 years ago, he said that first principles thinking is this idea that you start with the first basis from which a thing is known. So you start with the things you actually really know, not this mental shortcut of assume this thing is true. And the way we like to think about first principles thinking is there's essentially 3 ways you can do this. And you should do all 3, but inside out. This is a fundamental understanding of the consumer need. A really beautiful example of this is, who does this really, really well, is Intuit, the accounting software company. Intuit has a model they call the follow me home, which is really fascinating. It's like every single person in the Intuit organization, literally from the janitor all the way to the CEO, spends at least a day shadowing a customer, following the customer and seeing what is the customer actually doing with my product in the real world. Not in a lab, not in a report, but actually spending time with the customer to really understand what does the customer actually want. And I would argue that many companies are too removed from the customer. We like to talk about what we like to call paperclip companies. So you make paper clips, but you actually don't know why you're making paper clips anymore. And your customer also, you fulfill currently a need for them, but that need, you don't understand the underlying need. Again, Clayton Christensen's good literature on this one. The second one is, of course, outside in. This is where you look at the mega trends. And I don't need to tell you that. I need to tell this mostly startups because they never do it. But this idea is there's things you know will happen. Aging population, we know is a fact, right? There's a certain things. Climate change is a fact. You can't deny it. You can prepare for it. And then the third one is, and this is a rather unique one, is this idea of what can you actually learn from parallel worlds? So a good example is a company we work with called Grupo Breca. It's the second largest conglomerate in Peru. 10% of the GDP of the country, which is nuts. And they do anything from mining all the way up to hospitality and financial services, et cetera. And their financial services unit had issues around customer service, as many financial services institutions have, unfortunately. And what they've done is they said, like, where do we find a parallel world in terms of customer service? Where do we find actually, where can we learn how customer service works better? And they happen to have hospitality. So what they did is they looked at hospitality. They said, like, how do we actually run customer service in our hotels, in our restaurants, et cetera? And then started bringing executives from the banking unit into the hospitality unit to shadow them, to understand what's happening there. So this is the first principles thinking. And the question we like to ask, again, this is a pretty provocative question, and I know it's a little facetious, but I like to ask an executive, it's like, how much time did you actually spend with a customer last week or the week before, whatever? And I'm not saying whining and dining or selling them anything. I'm saying, like, actually spending time with them on their product need, like on their needs and wants. And the answer is literally 0. And I was really surprised. Michael was in the meeting as well. We did this at the DCPA. So these are, smaller to medium-sized CPA firms. And I was expecting those guys need to spend a lot of time with their customers. More than 50% of them spend less than 2 hours a week with a customer. And it's a huge, that's crazy. I get it if you're the CEO of PepsiCo, clearly you don't have the time to spend time with the customer, though you should probably. But if you're like the CPA in a 20-people company, in a 20-people firm, and you're not spending time with the customer, I think that's a huge miss. Anyway, so second one, these companies have a very deep fundamental understanding of what does the customer need. And then the third one, and this is the one I think we want to spend a little bit more time about. This concept around the core and the edge. The idea of, like, you have a core of your business and you have a new side of the business. And the way we like to think about the core is your current existing business. This is where you make all your money. This is where you know how to do things. And then there's the edge. This is the stuff you want to explore, the new things. I spoke to the Black & Decker folks. You have really amazing edge businesses, interesting initiatives going on there. Old school versus new school, or low risk in the core because you know what you're doing, high risk, or all the money, none of the money, right? So just be clear. You make no money on the edge. Like, this is where you try things out. Now that leads to interesting challenges, and I'm pretty sure you're well aware of them because you feel them. In the core of your business, it's a little bit like a tanker or an aircraft carrier. Like, you set it on course, it moves, and it just moves. And what you're really doing is, and I don't need to tell you this, it's all about being efficient, effective, and optimized, right? All your metrics around this as well. Now here's the thing, when you get to the edge, and this is where it gets really complicated, make no mistake, this is really hard to do. But at the edge, you're running a speedboat. You need to try things out. And the problem with that is, at the edge, it's not about being efficient, effective, and optimized. It's all about learning. And I think, as a leader, as CEO, COO, CFO, you ultimately need to be bipolar. Because you need to walk into one meeting and tell people, friends, it's all about productivity. We're measuring ROI, we're measuring margin, and so on. And then you turn around and have a meeting with the edge team, and you say, forget anything I just said, and it's all about the number of experiments and the learnings we're grabbing from there. You do the exact opposite of the work you're doing in the core. In the core, you try to minimize any variance. You try to churn out as many gadgets as you can, of course, it's possible, lowest price, etc. On the edge, you do the exact opposite. And it's interesting, Pearson, largest learning company in the world, based out of London, in their edge businesses, they actually have metrics around how many experiments did we run and how many learnings did we get out of them. And that's the only thing they measure them on, because you can't measure them on revenue. And it leads to an interesting world. It leads to a world where there's a thing we like to call the time horizon fallacy. And as a practitioner in this field, because I operated in this field, operate still to this day, I can tell you a story. So you all heard about the 3 time horizon model, right? This is, I believe it came, every consultancy has it. I believe it originally came from McKinsey. Time horizon 1, the here and now. Time horizon 3, out there, R&D. Time horizon 2, the in-between. My friends from EY like to call this the now, next, and beyond, which is a nice label. Now here's the argument. McKinsey's argument was always this, and it makes sense. They say you need to, as a company, you need to have investments in all three horizons, et cetera, et cetera. I got to work with Geoffrey Moore, the guy who wrote Crossing the Chasm, and he points out something which I've then, after I could see it, because he told me, I saw everywhere. Because there's an interesting problem in the time horizons, which is this. Most companies operate, every company is good in time horizon 1, otherwise you wouldn't exist. Most companies don't even engage in time horizon 3, R&D, which is also fine. And then you have these things in time horizon 2, the in-between. This is like the next thing, the 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, whatever time horizon is relevant to your industry. And if you operate in time horizon 2, and I used to operate in time horizon 2 all my life when I was an operator, you fall into the following challenges, the following buckets. The first one is this, fallacy number 1, and I'm pretty sure you heard this. I operate in time horizon 2, I go to time horizon 1 because I need resources. At one point I'm like, okay, we're ready to do this, right? So I go to time horizon 1 and I say, hey, time horizon 1, we've got this great idea, can you please give me the resources? And then time horizon 1 comes to me and says, when will you make $100 million? Or whatever number time horizon 1 is used to measuring me, right? And if I'm faithful, truthful in time horizon 2, and trust me, I've done this, you sit there and you say, I have no idea. Because nobody has ever done this before. I don't know. And then, of course, what time horizon 1 does is time horizon 1 says, well, come back when you have an idea. Goodbye. Right? So I don't get the resources. Now, time horizon 2 people, like myself, get smarter over time because we're not dumb. So what do? We go to time horizon 1, and this is absolutely without any judgment, but we go to time horizon 1, we show them a spreadsheet which has bullshit numbers on it, it's always exponential growth, and we say, this is how it looks like. And then time horizon 1 says, okay, I'm satisfied, I give you the resources. That's the first problem. There's so many projects I've seen being killed in time horizon 2 because they couldn't get the resources, because they couldn't essentially fib their way to success. So, that's the first fallacy. Second fallacy is this. Time horizon 1 gives the resources to time horizon 2. Time horizon 2 now does stuff. Time horizon 1 eventually might fall on hard times. God forbid, a global pandemic, a downturn in the market, whatever it is. What does time horizon 1 do all the time? They go to time horizon 2 and they say, give me the resources back because you're not making any money. And that is, of course, the worst thing you can possibly do because time horizon 2 is your future, time horizon 1 is essentially the past. So you need to protect the resources if you engage in time horizon 2, but it happens all the time. Happened to me so many times where I had resources, money, and people being pulled away. And then the third one, and this is what Geoffrey likes to point out, a common mistake you can make if you are operating in time horizon 1 and 2 at this intersection is that we try to do too many things in time horizon 2 and pull them through into the market at the same time. And that confuses everyone. So if you're doing a major time horizon 2 initiative, major, not like tiny ones, but major, you can only do one at a time. Good example, and Geoffrey advised Apple on this, so he was the personal advisor to Steve Jobs on this. Apple had the iPhone and the iPad ready at the same time. We know this today because, hindsight. But Apple decided to only bring the iPhone to market because they knew that if they bring both to market, it would confuse the market, and it would confuse Apple itself. So famously, when they interviewed Steve Jobs, when he introduced the iPhone, and they said, hey, are you going to build a tablet? Because there were other tablets on the market already, so the form factor was known. Steve Jobs famously said, tablets are the dumbest thing on the planet, we will never build a tablet. Because he needed to protect the market. He needed to protect the consumer and the resources and basically put all the attention to the iPhone. And then 2 years later, they launched the iPad. And there's a really funny clip where someone went to him and said, to Steve Jobs and said, didn't you say 2 years ago iPads are the dumbest thing? And Steve Jobs looks at him, stares him in the eye and says, I've never said that. Right? So that's great leadership because you protect the resources. So you have to think about the time horizons. And that gets us to this whole idea around the core and the edge. Because here's the thing. Many people, there's a dear friend of mine and a colleague, John Hagel, used to be at the Deloitte Center for the Edge, incredible thinker, amazing person. They will tell you how to run your core and the edge. They will tell you, John will tell you, you have to separate the core and the edge. They need to be different, completely different. You can't, there's many reasons why this doesn't work. The edge needs to be its own entity, and then eventually the edge grows so big that it will take over the core. That's one way. And then you hear people who say, oh, this is bullshit, this doesn't work. Like this is not realistic. What you need to do is you need to have a membrane between the two of them. You have executives who are like jumping between them. And then you say people say this is bullshit, it doesn't work. What you have to do is you need to bring companies together, and you do it in one entity. And what I found over the years is there isn't a right or wrong answer. I think what you need to do is you need to figure out what is your company culture, how you're operating, how you're set up, to find the right setup for you, because it's very individual to the culture. What we did find, though, is there's a couple of things in the setup on how you think about core and the edge, and they are universally true. And the first one is this one. You need to figure out how do you actually think about risk and reward. And that's a really hard one to do. Simple reason. This is a bit of a oversimplification I'm going to present you. It's just easier to present that way. If you're thinking about your business, there's a part in your core business which you know eventually will decline. You know, it might decline over 20 years, but you know that there's not a lot of growth in there. And that's fine, and you play defense in that business, and that's absolutely fine because you want to milk the cow. You might make a lot of money. You might make a lot of like free cash flow in these businesses, absolutely fine. But you play defense. Then there's another set of activities which are in the core of your business where you do innovation. So you make something which is a little bit better, and you know that there's opportunity for growth. It's not exponential growth, but it's the, like the 3%, 4%, 5% growth you have year over year. This is where you start playing offense, but in the core. And then there's the third type of company, which is the stuff you do where you have the potential for exponential growth. This is the stuff you do at the edges of your organization. And we like to think about people, because ultimately it comes down to people, right? Herb Kelleher said, business of people is people, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So when you think about the people, it becomes really interesting. Again, this is a stereotype, I know, but it helps to think that way. We believe people fall into three categories, and we've got, there's ample evidence for this. You've got farmers, gatherers, and hunters. And this has a lot to do with their appetite for risk. Farmers, clearly, they are the ones who stay on the homestead. They're the people who optimize stuff. They love to see, grow the corn grow and make sure that, there is no pests on the corn, etc. They have a very low appetite for risk. They don't want to travel off the homestead. They just want to stay there. They want to get up in the morning and get to bed in the afternoon. Then you've got gatherers. So gatherers are the ones who are innovating. Gatherers are the ones who are going out and picking up the fruit from the tree or stealing the honey out of the beehive. But gatherers like to sleep in their own bed in the night. Right? So they come home in the evening and like to sleep in their own bed. And then you've got hunters. Hunters are the crazy ones. Hunters are the ones who are going out there trying to get the woolly mammoth. They know very well that they will die. There's a really good chance for them that they will die. But they also know that if they make it, they bring back the woolly mammoth and they're the king of the castle. Right? So these guys are the crazy ones. They go out there and disrupt. And I do think that you need to figure out, people fall, broadly speaking, into these categories, and they don't move all that much between the categories. There's movement, no question, but they fall into those categories. And the question becomes, how do you even attract hunters? Because the problem is that we typically don't set up the reward systems for them. Right? We say, you take all the risk, you go out there, you try this thing, your career might be over in this company if you fail with this. Oh, by the way, if you succeed, we tap you on the shoulder, because the question becomes really, how do you even attract hunters? How do you keep them inside of your organization? And the example I have for this is, when did you give an employee who created a new $1 billion business a $25 million bonus? It doesn't happen. What we do is we give them a golden watch. Right? And granted, this is a little bit black and white, but this is what happens. And in our world, for good reasons, we still promote based on status, obedience, and conformity. Right? And that's fine. It's fine for gatherers and farmers, but you don't get hunters. I speak to a lot of big corporations who admit to me that they don't have hunters. Or if they have hunters, they drive them out of the organization really quickly. And that's a problem, because if you don't have hunters, you can't disrupt. Number one. Number two is, and you heard this many, many times, large teams solve problems, small teams create new problems to solve. So one thing you have to do in your setup is if you want to do something on the edge, and my friend John Hagel likes to call this starve the edge. And he's right. If you give them too many resources, if the office is too plush, if they have got too many people, it doesn't work. Because the moment you bring teams together which are bigger, you get all these social problems. And they're well studied, right? Like anything from social loafing, loss of cohesion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to do something on the edge, you have to keep these teams small, at least in the beginning. Because otherwise, nothing will happen. And then you've got the third part. And I mentioned yesterday in the for the advisory group, I mentioned that one of our clients is PepsiCo. And I want to tell you a really interesting story. And this is, I think it's illustrative of this particular point. When you want to do something on the edge, you want to do something innovative and disruptive, you need to give the people who work on it control over the experience. And let me just give you, and absolutely no disrespect for this company, but let me give you the typical example. The typical example is something like Coca-Cola does. They go to you and you say, I want to do something new, and they say, that's great, you have got freedom within the system. What this means is you can do anything you want, but it needs to look like Coca-Cola. And it makes sense, right? Because they come and say, well, brand reputation and a customer base, and there's a million reasons, which are all fair and good reasons why you want to do that. But the problem is, once you do this, every product looks like this. And again, no disrespect for Coca-Cola, but Coca-Cola has not a single product which doesn't look like Coca-Cola. And you can say that's great, but they will never disrupt. Now compare this with this. And this is interesting. Again, we work with PepsiCo. I used to work with PepsiCo under Indra, and now we're working with PepsiCo under Ramon, their new CEO. The new CEO is phenomenal. I can't say enough good things about Ramon. He's super entrepreneurial. He's also a 25-year Pepsi veteran, so he bleeds PepsiCo. Here's a story, true story, and we were part of that story. We followed that story along, what PepsiCo did. PepsiCo has a unit called SodaStream. This is an acquisition out of Israel, makes bubbly water. Anyone have a SodaStream machine at home? What? You should get SodaStreams, they're amazing. Okay, so if you have a SodaStream, you know what is the number one pain point of the SodaStream is to replace the canister. So you have a carbon dioxide canister, which is used to make the bubbly. The way you replace the canister is, you take the canister out, you go to Target or Bed Bath & Beyond, similar to Blockbuster's old model, and get it replaced. And then you have a new canister. It's a pain in the neck. So the team came up with this great idea and said, we want to build a direct-to-consumer business. Makes perfect sense, right? We send you a new canister, you ship us the old canister back, everybody's happy. PepsiCo never, ever had a direct-to-consumer business. They have no idea how to do this. So what does the team do? What does a normal team do? A normal team would go to Deloitte, Accenture, any of those guys, and say, we need to build a direct-to-consumer business. Can you consult on it? $25 million later, you've got 400 PowerPoint slides. You know how to do a direct-to-consumer business. And then about $50 million later, and 2 years later, you eventually have built one. And no disrespect for these people, right? What did this team do? Because Ramon went to them and said, you need to do what you need to do. You don't need to do what PepsiCo tells you to do. You want to build a direct-to-consumer business, so build a direct-to-consumer business. So what does the team do? They look at all the direct-to-consumer businesses which are out there. Like anything from Casper mattresses to Warby Parker to Allbirds to whatever it is. And they look at how do these companies do it? And they discover that all of these companies use one product, more or less, Shopify. They run all of their stuff on Shopify. So what does the team do? They take their credit card, they pay $299 a month for Shopify store and launch the store within 2 months. Their current expenditure on e-commerce is $299. 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference with EY. I sat down with the chief strategy officer of PepsiCo because I know that story really well. He didn't know that story. I tell him the story. He's like, oh, this is Ramon. This is great. And I tell him, let me save you 2/3 on your expenditure. He's like, what do you mean? I say, you're overpaying. You're not using any of the features of the $299 plan. You can easily get away with the $75 plan. This is nuts. I tell these companies, like, which company, that just ask yourself, would you sign off on a $299 e-commerce store versus a $20 million, whatever, like custom built? That's crazy. But time to market, they have got the best customer experience, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what happens when you give people freedom. So the question becomes, How do you actually manage the tension between these two sides? How do you manage the tension between the core and the edge? Because you do have to be bipolar. You need to be able to walk into a meeting and say, okay, this is all about the penny pinching, efficiency, effectiveness, optimization. Then you need to turn around and say, what did we learn today? Right? That's crazy. It's really hard to do. Which gets us to the fourth point. Remember, we talked about point one, process. First principles was the second one. Core and edge, the managing of core and edge is the third point. Fourth point is leadership. Of course, it's all about leadership. And in leadership, we found a couple of common denominators. And I want to briefly share them with you. First of all, as a leader, you have to commit. And that sounds very obvious, but let me tell you a story. This story is from a dear friend of mine, Maurice Conti. Maurice used to be the head of moonshots at Telefonica Alpha, which is the, essentially the European version of Google X. And he likes to call disruptors cowboys, because here's the story. The leadership team in a big corporation goes and sees a John Wayne cowboy movie. And they're enamored with the cowboys. And they're like, man, cowboys are awesome. We want to have cowboys. So what do? They hire cowboys, disruptors, right? And then the cowboys come in and they do their cowboy thing and they get a whole floor where the cowboys can do their thing. And then about a week later, I guarantee you this always happens. A week later, management team goes down to cowboys and says, you know guys, you're on horses. And that's really cool and like looks great. But I mean, horses are so 19th century. Also, they smell, they take a lot of upkeep, there's poop everywhere. Can we replace the horses with trucks? And the cowboys, because, you know, they want to do the work. They're like, yeah, you know, like, we're growing up on horses, really our thing, but okay, let's get trucks. So a week later, they all drive around with trucks. Then about a week later, HR, no disrespect for HR comes down and says, hey guys, cowboys, you're running around with guns, right? And the cowboys are like, of course, we're cowboys, what are you thinking? You can't run around with guns, man, this is like, it's illegal, can't do that. You know, workplace safety. Could you please use toy guns? And the cowboys are like, you know, maybe, okay. And this goes on and on until at the end of the process, you have a whole bunch of old white dudes running around with cowboy hats. That's what happens in organizations because they don't actually commit. You have this fantasy of you want innovation, you want disruption, you want to be like Google X, but then you're not actually willing to do the things which are behind that. So it's really important that leadership actually commits to those things. The interesting question you can ask yourself is, what will actually happen when you're successful? Is an interesting question for PepsiCo, for example, when they started their direct-to-consumer business, right? What happens if the direct-to-consumer business has become so successful that you don't sell these canisters anymore to Target and Bed Bath & Beyond? Are you willing to have the call from Target who yells at you and says, guys, we don't make any money with you anymore? Are you willing to do that? Right? You need to commit to those things before you actually even embark on the journey. Number one. Second one, you need to unknow. And that's a really fascinating one because here's the thing. You walk into a world where you don't know. This is Maurice Conti, the guy who told me the cowboy story. He used to work for Autodesk, the software maker out of San Francisco. He used to report to the CTO, and his role was to do the innovative stuff. And he went to the CTO, and this is a true dialogue. He went to the CTO and said, what do you want me to do? And the CTO said, look into our blind spots. I want you to look at the stuff we don't know. And then Maurice said to him, smartly, by definition, though, you then can't tell me what I have to do. And the CTO, to his credit, said, yes, I don't know. That takes guts. It's really interesting because your destination, if you're embarking on this journey, is inherently unknown. And if that is true, and it is true, the question becomes, how comfortable are you with being uncomfortable? We had this conversation last night at one of the tables. How comfortable are you actually with being uncomfortable? Or, even more importantly, how do you lead into and in the unknown? I teach at Berkeley Haas. We don't teach them anything about how do you lead into and the unknown. We still assume that they can know and that you as the leader have the answers. That's bullshit. It doesn't work anymore, right? Third piece on leadership. Inverting the power structures, inverting the flow of information. The old way of how we're building companies is the military, right? It's like you have the divine leader, and the divine leader gives the instructions, and then we all march to that order. The outcome of that is the org chart. The org chart is an interesting expression, right? Because it's like this idea that we tell people you have to be in these lines and boxes. But the challenge with that is, of course, information, we believed information flows from the top to the bottom. Like, I'm the CEO, I tell my VPs tell the directors tell the people on the ground. Now, the reality, of course, is what you need to do is, you need to find a way to get actually, the people on the ground are the people who see the customer need. You need to get the information up from them. You need to use them as sensing mechanisms. And your role isn't to tell them what they need to do. Your role is to set the goal for them, like the vision, the direction, the North Star. The way we like to think about this is, essentially, I believe the best organizations, and I've seen it, the best organizations are a bit like this flock of starlings, technically a murmuration of starlings. Because when you look at why do they actually move in these absolutely beautiful patterns, there is actually systems to the madness. Because what these birds do is 3 things at any given time. They know what their direction is. They know where they need to go to, like as in, here's south, here's where I migrate to. They take into account at any given time the environment, as in their case, upwinds, drifts, temperatures, etc. And they look and orient themselves at any given time on the birds around them. And what they do is they move in the most efficient, effective way, the least energy-consuming way from A to B. And I think the best organizations operate exactly like this. Amazon is a really good example for this, where if you work at Amazon, I interviewed with Amazon 4 times, I turned them down 4 times for various reasons, but you know what your North Star is. And you take into account at any given time what's happening in the environment, and you orient yourself on other people. The old way was this idea of like you get the strategy right? And then in the new way, it's really not about the strategy anymore, it's about the direction. You need to know what is my North Star. And then the old way, we believe we move linearly from A to B. And the new way is what a friend of mine calls the drunken walk of the entrepreneur. If you've been out in Smashville, as Michael likes to call this place here, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you know where the hotel is, and then you take into account the fact that the earth is moving really quickly left and right? But that's how we're moving these days. Now, last one is persistence. And this is an important one, and I think it's one which we don't talk all that much about. Because if you look at startups, the overnight successes, there's a really interesting lesson to be learned. Many people I talk to, they think that transformation is a from-to journey. They literally say, we've got this transformation effort, and then we're done. It's, of course, bullshit. It will never be over. Like, that's the good and the bad news for you. It will never be over. It's a continuous process. And the old way of thinking about this is this. A startup, you're with Yelp, correct? Yelp, the overnight success, 7 to 10 years in the making, before they were the overnight success, right? It's always this way. Now, here's the thing. Average tenure of a Fortune 500 CEO, 5 years and declining. More importantly, average tenure of a high potential in any given job, what, 2 years, 3 years before you promote them away? And for good reasons. But here's the thing, how do you want to get anything ever done if your transformation efforts take 6, 7 years? If you are promoting the people away, what does the next person do in the job? Of course, their whole role is to reinvent it, right? It's interesting, you can learn this from the game industry. This goes all the way back to Electronic Arts. I asked them, if you know anything about making games, one of these blockbuster games takes 7 years to make. It's a huge effort. And I said, how many of those people are actually churning through the game? And the Electronic Arts folks showed me data, which shows that 98% of the core team stays with the project for 7 years. It's doable. You can actually sort these things out if you give people the right incentives, the right purposes, the right abilities. But we are set up in a way where we don't do this. It's devastating. We do a leadership program over at PepsiCo with the emerging leaders, so the next business unit leaders there. And they get promoted every 18 months. I get it. They want them to see every single part of PepsiCo. I'm like, but these people will not implement any changes whatsoever. They will do little things, and then they will be undone 18 months later. And the interesting question you can ask yourself is, what will you be doing 5 years from now? Well, it's a hard question. It's fascinating. All right. Last one, and then we're done. Upskilling. This was the one which surprised me most. Not that it's important, but that it became named as one of the 5 things. And when you think about upskilling and reskilling, remember we talked about this idea that when you go from one state to the next, your existing skills and processes become irrelevant, which means that you need to take your people with you. And the 2 things I heard over and over again, and those were a little bit more insightful than just saying, oh, you need to upskill and reskill, is this. Question of, you move from one game, this is like how we need to think about this. You're playing tennis today, which is a game which is played with a fist-sized ball and a racket. And the game changes for you, and you start playing, say, cricket. Now, some people say it's not a game, it's a different story. It's a way of life, I heard. It's still a cricket, right? It's still a ball, it's still a bat you play with, but you need to use very different muscles, and this is how you want to think about skilling. And the two questions you need to ask is, first of all, relevancy. What do people actually need to know for their job? And this is interesting because I see a lot of companies, they have commitments to reskilling and upskilling. And what do? They buy a subscription to LinkedIn Learning and then give it to everyone in the company. And then they hope that by them watching like how to play the guitar better, you know, something happens. The best companies I know, good example, Klöckner Steel, the CEO sat down and said, where do we want to go? Working backwards, what are the skills we need? What are the skills we can develop in our people? What are the skills we need to buy into the company? And then work with, of course, the HR team, et cetera, to get those skills. I think reskilling and upskilling is absolutely the job of the C-suite. It's really important. So getting to relevancy. So what do we really need to know? And then the second one is this. How do you get it down to scale? Because many companies I've seen, and we get invited to do this, right? Like I sit down with the VPs, and then I talk to the VPs and I say, how does this actually get this stuff we teach you here? How does this stuff get down to your people? And they say, well, osmosis, right? Like I will tell my direct reports and then hopefully they will tell their direct reports. Of course that doesn't work. So the best companies actually think about how do we actually scale those things down. So that being said, here's an interesting thing you see and you experience once you engage in learning in a meaningful way. Because what you know becomes who you are. I have a lot of conversations with companies who are like, oh, we need to change our culture. And I say, that's fine, and that's probably right. The easiest way for you to change your culture is actually to put different knowledge into your people's heads, because that changes the culture automatically. So 5 things: process, first principles, core edge, leadership pieces, and upskilling. Those are the 5 pieces we heard consistently from every single company we work with. If you lean into those, I think you have a really good chance to actually drive these processes. Remember, it's about transformation. It's not about disruption per se. This is a quote which the leader of the innovation unit at Brain gave me. He also happens to be an BAFTA award-winning documentary filmmaker, which is pretty incredible. And he said to me, really, innovation is like making love. It's a voluntary act out of your dreams and your courage. And I think that's exactly what it is. It's not something you plan on a spreadsheet. Last quote, because I like my quotes. This here is Ron Shaich. Ron is the former founder, president, CEO of Panera Bread, healthy fast food chain here in the United States. Sold the company for $7 billion to private equity. Is a massive multiple of what you would get for a company like his normally. And I sat down with him, I had dinner with him, he paid. He's much richer than I am. And I said, Ron, how did you do this? And if you know anything about Panera, Panera had digital ordering way earlier than anyone else. They have a fully digitized supply chain, yada, yada, yada. So very early in all these technologies. And he said something so profound to me that night that I literally wrote it down on a piece of paper. Because he said, our approach at Panera has always been to discover today what matters tomorrow and then to transform our company into a future that is unfolding before us. And I think that's exactly what we have to do as leaders. We need to figure out what matters tomorrow, think about what is the future, and then create that pathway towards that future. And with that, I am at the end. I have an invitation for you. We have an internal learning partner community, which we invite all our clients to normally. So these are, C-suite folks from all, companies, all walks of life. If you want to be part of that, free of charge membership, lifetime membership, just send a blank email to this email address. There's a little bot behind it. It'll automatically add you to this. Now, with that being said, I'm at the end, and I want to bring back Tanner, because Tanner had the chance to see some of this, all of it, before you. And Tanner got tasked with thinking about how does this apply or how does it fit into Nike. And I think it's a beautiful way to bridge this into the conversation we want to have with you afterwards. With that being said, Tanner.
Well, I'm not as tall as Pascal, so I'm going to stand up. I'm going to stand up here if that's okay. Pascal, that was absolutely amazing. Great insights. So as Pascal said, I'm here to share a little bit about kind of some of these concepts and what we've applied at Nike, or what we kind of plan on applying at Nike. So with that, a couple things. The first one that I would say that applies here at Nike, I have the opportunity of leading up, and it kind of falls under that concept of state change. And so we're implementing, I know we're quite far behind many of your organizations in implementing our first shared delivery model for finance. And so as we're talking, just so to give everybody a clear heads up, if you have a shared delivery model, I'm going to probably ask you about some lessons learned that you've had. But I'm leading that up, and I think about that as a state change and a big one for our organization. We've tried it time and time again, and it hasn't worked. But I feel fully confident that this time it's going to work. My passion area is really taking on those roles and tasks that have been tried in the past and haven't come to fruition. So I think about that as a state change. I also think about it, we talked about kind of water, vapor, ice. I think about it, at Nike a little bit as a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And there's a concept that Pascal had also, or a quote that he had shared that, you can avoid reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of reality. And I kind of see that's where our function is at right now. I've heard time and time again, hey, Tanner, I've been here, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I hear transformation time and time again, and it still looks the same. And, I think that's powerful input for me as I take on this leadership role to make sure that we're doing the things that are true state changes for our function. And I have a high level of confidence that it's gonna come together. Core and edge, I think is one, and as I reflected on that when Pascal introduced it to me, I looked at one of my last roles. One of my last roles was leading our internal control over financial reporting, ICFR SOX program, something that you think about as super, super core to your organization. I had the unique ability to kind of take that and move it to the edge and truly, think about it differently. I think the concept of first principles, I implemented that. I do have the benefit. I did a national office tour with the firm, with PwC in their audit policy team. So I knew pretty clearly kind of what the audit policy was of our external auditors. And so equipped with that, we took that and we totally, I was given a ton of autonomy to reform what we were doing. And we went in there with a very disruptive mindset. We stayed within the guardrails, but some of the things that came out of that in the short amount of time that I was in role, first we moved our platform that we were working on to a new platform, and we did that in a matter of weeks, and we did it at a zero cost. And we did it at a zero cost because our firm that we employ, EY, saw the benefit of it and said, we'll invest in that because we're going to get benefit from it as well. So not a lot of times that you're able to move your SOX platform from one to another in a matter of weeks. True concept to implementation was a matter of weeks and at $0. The other thing that we did is we took down the number of controls that we tested beyond a control self-assessment by over 50%. And again, there was a lot of unlearning that needed to happen. My leader was a former EY partner, so very knowledgeable of the integrated audit. But what we really kind of back to that first principles, we took that and we said, what's true to management? And that's unlearn everything else. And so with that, we were able to reduce a significant amount of our testing. We reduced our deficiencies by over 80%. We reduced our cost of testing by roughly 30%. And I anticipate this year that we'll reduce our external audit fees by probably a low single digits percent. So, where a lot of companies are going one direction, we looked at it and said, how can we take it a completely different direction? So that core and edge was really kind of at the middle of what we leveraged there. I really like the strategy. To talking a bit about the strategy, Pascal, around, getting the strategy right is old school, getting the direction right is the new school. So at Nike, we recently launched finance transformation. I think a lot of companies have been going through a finance transformation. But what I get empowered about is when we look at our strategic house, kind of our mission, our vision, the ways that we're going to win and how we're going to measure ourselves. Our vision is to be a finance powerhouse. Our finance transformation, is around giving our team the resources they need to do their best and most fulfilling work. And what I like about that, and there's a concept that we have at Nike, which is there is no finish line. And so what it allows us to do is not have a definitive, point of success. There's going to be successes, there's going to be failures along the way, but what it allows us to do, because the industry is going to keep, progressing, it makes us, really focus on continuing to progress. Today's win, right, ends up being, tomorrow's focus on how we continue to make that better. So, being a finance powerhouse and giving our teammates or our teams the resources they need to do their best and most fulfilling work is our focus. And then the last one that I would talk about is upskilling and reskilling that we're talking about. Through that transformation, and to be frank, I've been fairly critical of our transformation, that this is an area that's kind of pretty late in our roadmap for investment. And what I've been very boisterous about is that should have been our first investment. Getting our resources, the skills, the training, kind of the mindset shifts that they need in order to, be part of this transformation is so important. We should have been doing that first. I think our transformation would happen faster. It would happen better. And again, it's, I think that, that creation, right, having it created or co-created, it would allow us to really co-create that, more broadly amongst the function. There are a couple things that, I helped stand up and spearhead when I came into the organization, was a focus on talent. We stood up a talent council. We grassrooted a talent council, which has been tremendous. We use that to make sure that we're assessing our talent. We're going through that discipline procedures, getting the right trainings in place. And it was one that we saw the opportunity and we went after it, and now it's gone finance-wide. And the other thing that I spearheaded was standing up our first finance leadership development program. We had an MBA rotational program, but we didn't have something for our internal candidates. And so we spearheaded that, we stood it up, it was great success. And so what we did after the first cohort of the finance leadership development program, we merged the two. We saw the opportunity of scale. Leaders, our executive finance leadership team was focusing on the MBAs, and then they were focusing, separately on the internals, and we said, they're all internal. Let's bring them all together. And so those rotational programs have been great. We've focused on capabilities. So we have a framework called Leadership Defined. And Leadership Defined buckets the leadership capabilities into 3 different ones: grow yourself, grow others, grow the business. And when I first saw that, I said, well, why is grow yourself first? Shouldn't grow the business be first? But what was really important, and we focused at Nike a lot around our well-being, our holistic well-being. And I really, what triggered for me is you need to focus on yourself and make sure that you're healthy, right, before you can go and show up well for your team. And then that ultimately, drives the growth in business. But the capabilities that we're focused on, we picked 3. We sat down with our CFO and we said, what are the 3 capabilities within our framework that are most important as we focus on the future and developing these leaders with the future? So the first one under grow yourself is demonstrate self-awareness. Really being clear on where are you at, where are your growth opportunities, what are your strengths. Your strengths are going to get you right further than focusing on your opportunities. The second one under grow others was develop others. right? We all have gifts, but there's really an exponential impact if you can take and mentor and coach, and in instances having tough conversations and managing individuals for their full potential. So grow others was the second one. And finally, under grow the business was think strategically. So really have that unconstrained mindset. It's not all about the debits and credits, right? It's not all about the forecast. It's about the business. It's about getting outside of finance to our our partners, but ultimately to the athlete, and helping inspire them and bring innovation to every athlete in the world, which is Nike's ultimate mission statement.